By noon, their parking lot held 4 inches of standing water and a truck axle deep near the entrance. I didn't do that with a shovel. I did it with paperwork, 3 years old, and a culvert I'd never touched. I want to be clear about that before anything else. I didn't dig a thing. The wound was already there before the water came. It had been there since the survey crew showed up on a Tuesday in March, driving stakes into ground I'd cut hay on since I was 19, ground my father had cut hay on before that. Nobody from the association called first. Nobody asked. I found the stakes the way you find out about most things that get done to you instead of with you, by accident, walking the fence line with my dog, looking down at a patch of orange survey ribbon tied to a post I hadn't put there. 3 weeks later, the trenches appeared, 6 of them, cut in clean diagonal lines across the western pasture, angled just so, carrying runoff from the subdivision's new cul-de-sac straight through my drainage and off toward the low corner where my well sits. Someone had done the math. Someone had looked at a topographic map and figured out exactly where water wants to go, and then made sure it went there, onto my land, instead of pooling where it was supposed to, on theirs. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the trespass, the math. The person who ordered this understood drainage well enough to redirect it with precision. That takes a civil engineer, or someone close enough to one. That takes intent. I called the association office. A woman named Renata took the call, apologized in the vague way people apologize when they've been told to apologize but not to fix anything, and said she'd flag it for the board. I asked whose trucks had been on my property. She said she'd have to check. I asked for the flagging in writing. She went quiet for a second too long, then said she'd send something. Nothing came. I want to tell you I got angry that day. I didn't. I got still. There's a particular kind of stillness that settles into you when you realize a thing wasn't a mistake. When the pattern of it, the deliberateness of it, arrives before the outrage does. I stood in that trench, mud past my boot tops, and I understood 2 things at once: that this had been planned, and that whoever planned it had never once considered that I might document. I went inside and got a notebook. Before the trenches, before the survey stakes, I was just a woman running 40 acres the way it had been run for 2 generations. Hay in the front fields, a small herd of Angus in the back 40, a well that never failed, and a drainage system my father built by hand with a rented backhoe in 1987, cut to follow the natural fall of the land instead of fighting it. I wasn't rich. I wasn't trying to be. I sold hay to 3 neighboring ranches and enough beef through a local co-op to keep the taxes paid and the equipment running. I fixed my own fence. I kept my own books, in ledgers, by hand, because I liked knowing exactly where every dollar and every acre stood. The subdivision went up on the old Kessler tract 6 years ago. 40 homes, curved streets with names like Meadowbrook Court and Whispering Pine Lane, though there wasn't a pine within 2 miles. The HOA came with it, the way it always does, and for the first few years we coexisted the way land and lawns usually do. At a slight distance, with the occasional complaint about my cattle smell drifting toward the fence line, and my occasional complaint about their kids cutting through my hayfield on dirt bikes. I didn't hate them. I want that understood. I'd wave at people at the feed store who I knew lived in the subdivision. I'd let the board president, a man named Gary Toms, hunt deer on my back acreage 2 seasons running, no charge, because that's what you do with a neighbor. What I had built, quietly, over 11 years of running that farm alone after my father passed, was a kind of order. Everything on that land answered to a plan: where the water went, where the cattle grazed, which field rested, and which one worked. It wasn't glamorous. It was just mine, understood down to the inch, and it worked because nobody interfered with it. That's what the trenches broke. Not the grass, the order. I think that's the part people who've never run land don't understand. It isn't sentimental, this feeling. It's structural. When someone reroutes water without your knowledge, they're not just moving mud around. They're overriding a system that took a decade to tune, and they're doing it with the casual confidence of people who've never had to live with the consequences of being wrong about water. Gary Toms, I would come to learn, was very confident about water. He had, in fact, ordered the whole thing. I met Gary Toms in person, about the trenches, on a Thursday afternoon in April, in the gravel lot outside the association's clubhouse, a squat brick building with a pool nobody used past September, and a bulletin board full of notices about lawn height and mailbox color. He came out to meet me before I'd even parked, which told me something. He'd been watching for my truck. He was a big, easy man, the kind who shakes your hand a beat too long and calls you by name twice in one sentence to make sure you feel seen. Denise, good to see you. Come on in. Come on in. I didn't move from the gravel. Gary, I want to talk about the trenches. His face did something practiced then, a little furrow, a little tilt. The exact expression of a man who has rehearsed concern. I heard about that. Real shame. We had a contractor out here doing storm drain work on the cul-de-sac, and I guess some of that runoff ended up going further than planned. I'll be honest with you, I don't have all the details yet. I let that sit in the air a second. Not because I was calculating anything, because I was listening to how smoothly it came out. A man who doesn't have details rarely produces a sentence that clean on his first try. The trenches are cut in 6 straight lines, Gary. Diagonal, angled toward my well corner. That's not runoff finding its way. That's routing. Well, I wouldn't know about the engineering side of it. He smiled the way people smile when they want the conversation to end warmly instead of honestly. I can have someone look into getting that filled back in, if that'd set your mind at ease. Filled back in, like a chore. Like I was asking him to mow a strip of grass, not undo a decision that had rerouted water onto private land without permission, without survey, without so much as a phone call. That was the moment. Not the trenches themselves. The trenches were damage, and damage can be an accident. It was this. It was watching a man stand in a gravel lot and offer to erase evidence and call it kindness. It was recognizing, the way you recognize a smell before your mind catches up to naming it, that Gary Toms had done this before. Not this exact thing, but this posture, this particular shape of confident vagueness, deployed on someone he assumed wouldn't push. I'd spent 11 years reading land. I could read a man just as easily. I don't want it filled back in yet, I said. I want to know who authorized it, what the contractor's scope of work says, and whether the association carries insurance for damage to adjacent properties. The furrow deepened, but something underneath it changed. Not concern. Recalculation. That's sure. I can look into that. Might take some time. Insurance stuff. You know how that is. He knew how that was. I would come to learn exactly how well he knew. I drove home that afternoon and did the only thing that made sense to me. I went and looked at the work itself. Slow, the way you'd read a contract instead of skimming it. 6 trenches. Not haphazard, spaced with almost exact even intervals, each one angled at what looked, to my eye, like a consistent 8 or 10 degree pitch, all funneling toward the low corner of my western pasture where my well sits, maybe 200 feet from the casing. That detail sat wrong in my stomach longer than anything else. A contractor doing storm drainage for a cul-de-sac doesn't accidentally produce 6 evenly spaced, identically angled trenches that all terminate near a private well. That's not runoff. That's a design. I walked the property line where the subdivision's grading met my fence and found tire tracks. Wide ones, consistent with heavy equipment. Not a single pass, but several, back and forth, over about a week, judging by how the ruts had begun to soften and reform with the rain. I found survey flags, the same orange ones from March, still standing at 2 of the trench heads, half buried now, but not removed. Someone had planned this on paper before they ever brought a machine onto my land. I took photographs, not because I had decided to build a case. I hadn't yet, not consciously, but because photographs are what you take when something doesn't add up and you don't yet know why. I photographed the trenches from 4 angles each. I photographed the survey flags. I photographed the tire ruts with a tape measure laid beside them for scale, an old habit from insurance claims after a hailstorm years back. I wrote the date on each one in a small notebook, along with a description, the way you'd log evidence. Though I didn't think of it as evidence then, I thought of it as making sense of something. That night I called my cousin Mara, who does contract law for a firm 2 counties over, not to ask her to represent me, just to ask her a question that had been sitting under my ribs since the gravel lot. If someone alters drainage on your land without permission, is that trespass or is it something else? She was quiet a second, then said, "Depends on the intent and depends on the damage. But Denise, if it's deliberate and if there's damage, that's not a neighbor dispute. That's a claim." I didn't say anything to that right away. I looked out the kitchen window at the dark shape of the western pasture, 6 wounds cut into it that I couldn't see anymore but knew were there, aimed like arrows at my well. "Keep everything," Mara said. "Every photo, every date, every conversation. Write it down like you're going to need it in a year, because you probably are." I already had the notebook open on the counter. I just hadn't known, until she said it, that I'd already started. The rain came 4 days later, and that's when I understood I hadn't been overreacting. It wasn't a hard rain, maybe 1.5 inches over 6 hours, the kind of storm this valley gets a dozen times a spring without incident. But by the 2nd hour, the western pasture had a sheet of standing water spreading out from the trench mouths that I had never once seen in 11 years of working that ground. My father's drainage had handled worse storms than this, without so much as a puddle past the fence line. Now the water had somewhere new to go, and it went there fast, toward the low corner, toward the well. I stood on the porch in a rain slicker watching it happen and felt something settle into place that wasn't panic. It was confirmation. The trenches weren't just misplaced runoff. They were functioning exactly as designed, funneling water off association land and onto mine, taking pressure off whatever drainage problem the cul-de-sac actually had and handing it to me instead. I got the well water tested that week, a baseline, before anything worse could happen to it. $240 out of pocket, receipt kept, sample results filed. Clean, for now. I wanted that on record before I ever needed it to matter. Then I started noticing things I hadn't been looking for. The association's monthly newsletter, which I'd started requesting after the gravel lot conversation, mentioned a Phase 2 drainage improvement project, approved by the board the previous November, 5 months before the trenches appeared, months before anyone spoke to me. I requested the meeting minutes. It took 3 emails and an unpleasant phone call with Renata before they arrived. And when they did, they were thin. A single paragraph noting the board had authorized Tom's Construction to proceed with drainage remediation on the western boundary, pending survey. Tom's Construction. I read that twice to make sure I wasn't inventing something out of coincidence. Gary Toms, board president, had authorized a contract to a company bearing his own name to perform drainage work that ended up routing water onto a neighboring property he had personally and only 2 weeks earlier stood in a gravel lot and called an accident. I didn't call him, I didn't call anyone. I opened a file, a real one, a manila folder, the kind you can hold. And I put the minutes in it, and the newsletter, and my photographs, and the well test, and a printed copy of the county's business registry showing Tom's Construction, LLC, registered agent Gary R. Toms, incorporated 14 months prior. I labeled the folder in pencil, plainly, the way I labeled everything on that farm. Western trenches. It wasn't strategy yet. It was just what you do when the ground under a story starts shifting, and you want proof of where it stood before it moved. Once I knew to look, the pattern didn't hide itself. That's the thing about a man like Gary Toms. He wasn't careful. Not really. He was confident. Those are different postures that look identical from a distance, and it took me weeks to understand which one I was dealing with. I started attending the association's monthly board meetings, which, as a non-resident landowner adjacent to the subdivision, I was technically entitled to observe, a fact Renata seemed surprised I knew. I sat in the back of the clubhouse meeting room with my notebook and said nothing for the first 2 meetings, just watched and wrote. I learned the rhythm of the place, how Gary ran the agenda, how 3 of the 5 board members deferred to him on anything involving construction or maintenance, how the 5th, a retired school teacher named Priya Anand, asked more questions than anyone seemed to want her to. At the second meeting, a resident named Dale Ferris stood up during open comment and complained that his own backyard had been flooding since March, worse than usual, and asked whether the new drainage work on the west side had anything to do with it. Gary told him no. The Phase 2 work was contained to the boundary line, nothing to worry about, and moved the agenda along before Dale could ask a follow-up. I wrote his name down. Dale Ferris. Flooding, March. I drove past Dale's house the following weekend, on the pretext of returning a dog that had wandered onto my property with a subdivision tag. The kind of small excuse that gets you standing in someone's driveway with a reason to talk. His fence line, which backed onto the same drainage system, showed the same telltale erosion pattern I'd seen in my own western pasture, just smaller. He hadn't documented anything. He'd just been annoyed and assumed it was bad luck. I told him it wasn't bad luck. I told him what Tom's Construction was and whose name was on the contract, and watched his face do the same thing mine had probably done in that gravel lot. The slow arrival of understanding replacing the assumption of accident. That was the first thread connecting to another thread. By early May, I had 3, my well corner, Dale's back fence, and a report from a woman 2 streets over whose retaining wall had begun to lean since the spring rains. None of them had documented anything beyond complaining at meetings. None of them had been taken seriously because none of them had photographs with dates, well tests with baselines, or a county registry printout showing exactly who profited from the work causing the damage. I wasn't building a case out of ambition. I was doing what any person does when they've watched enough seasons turn on the same 40 acres, noticing that a thing which looks like one accident, once you see it happen a second and third time in the same shape, stops being an accident and starts being a method. I added a second folder. Dale Ferris, flood pattern, then a third. I didn't yet know what I'd use them for. I only knew that paper, once you start keeping it, has a way of organizing itself into a shape that eventually points in one direction. By June, I had a filing box instead of a folder and a system instead of instinct. I bought a cheap accordion file at the farm supply store, the kind meant for tax receipts, and gave each section a label in the same plain pencil hand I used for everything else on that farm. Trenches, photos. Trenches, well tests. Board minutes. Tom's construction, public records. Neighbor statements. Correspondence. The correspondence section grew the fastest, mostly because I made sure it would. Every conversation I had with anyone connected to the association, I followed up in writing. If Renata told me something on the phone, I sent an email an hour later, confirming our call this afternoon, in which you stated, not accusatory, just precise, the way you'd write up a contract term you wanted on record. Most of the time, nobody corrected me. Silence, I was learning, could be treated as agreement if you were careful enough to frame the record that way. I requested, through a formal written petition to the board, a copy of the Phase 2 drainage project's engineering plans, the contractor's insurance certificate, and any correspondence between the board and Tom's construction predating the November vote. Association bylaws, which I had by then read cover to cover twice, required a response within 30 days. I noted the date I submitted it, June 9th, in the corner of my own copy, and mailed it certified. Return receipt requested, $4.30. Receipt filed. 30 days came and went. No response. I didn't call. I didn't send a reminder. I let the silence stand exactly as long as the bylaws allowed, and then some, because a violated deadline is its own kind of evidence, and chasing it would have blurred that. On day 41, I sent a second letter, also certified, noting the specific bylaw provision they'd failed to meet, and copying it, for the first time, to the county's HOA oversight office, whose existence I'd only recently learned about from Mara. That was the first time I felt something shift in the shape of things. Not triumph, just a small, cold clarity, the kind you get watching weather move in from a long way off and knowing, with total certainty, which way it's headed. 2 weeks later, Renata called. Her tone had changed. Less breezy, more careful, the voice of someone who'd been told to be careful. She said the board would be happy to discuss my requests at the next meeting, and that some of the documents might be subject to review before release. I asked which documents, specifically, needed review. She didn't have an answer ready. That told me more than anything she could have said. I hung up, opened the correspondence folder, and added the call, dated and summarized in my own hand, the way I'd learned to do without needing anyone to remind me anymore. The silence I'd been mistaken for surrender by people who assumed a woman running a farm alone didn't know how to build a file. I did. My father had taught me, without ever once using the word evidence, that the person who keeps the best records is the person who's still standing when the argument finally comes. The board meeting where they were supposed to discuss my requests came and went without discussion. Gary opened the floor, glanced at an agenda item labeled vaguely as drainage, boundary matter, and said the board needed more time to gather documentation, that these things took longer than people expected, that he appreciated everyone's patience. Priya Anand asked from her seat at the end of the table, why an insurance certificate, a document any contractor is required to carry and any client is entitled to request on demand, would take more than 6 weeks to produce. Gary said he'd have to check with counsel. I wrote that down too. Counsel, not the office, not Renata, counsel. Somewhere between my second letter and that meeting, someone had decided this required a lawyer, which told me the file I'd built, without any legal training worth the name, had already grown teeth I hadn't fully appreciated. I requested that same week, my well be retested, a second baseline, 3 months after the first, purely to establish trend. Still clean, but the nitrate levels had ticked upward, not dangerously, not yet, but measurably, the kind of shift that means something is changing even if it hasn't yet become a crisis. I filed that result beside the first one, side by side, dates 2 inches apart on the page, the trend line visible to anyone who looked. I also, for the first time, hired someone, not a lawyer, not yet, but a private civil engineer named Robert Illich, who did drainage consulting for ranch and farm clients across 3 counties. I paid him out of pocket $600 to walk the western pasture and write a professional assessment of the trench system. Its grading, its likely origin point, its probable effect on subsurface water flow toward my well. He didn't need to speculate about intent. He only needed to describe what any competent engineer would see. And what he saw, in his own careful language, was a constructed diversion structure inconsistent with incidental runoff, exhibiting deliberate grade manipulation consistent with directed drainage design. I read that sentence more times than I'll admit. It said, in the clean, neutral language of a professional with no stake in my anger, exactly what I had known standing in that trench back in March with mud past my boot tops. I added his report to the box. Engineering assessment, Illich. The accordion file was thick now, heavier than it looked, the kind of weight that doesn't announce itself until you pick it up and realize how much has accumulated while you were simply doing what needed doing, one dated page at a time. I hadn't confronted anyone. I hadn't threatened anyone. I had simply kept walking my own land, asking my own questions, and writing down what I found, the way I'd always done. The case wasn't something I was building the way you build a fence, post by deliberate post. It was building itself out of a pattern that had never once required me to raise my voice. By late July, the county's HOA oversight office responded to my complaint, not with resolution, but with a formal request that the association produce the requested documents within 15 days or face referral to the state's Community Association Ombudsman. That single letter did more in 2 weeks than 6 months of my own polite persistence had managed. Institutions listen to other institutions in a way they don't always listen to a person standing alone in a gravel lot. The documents arrived 9 days later, delivered not by Renata but by an attorney named Fields, representing the association, who included a cover letter far more careful than anything Gary had ever said to my face. The engineering plans, when I finally read them, showed something I hadn't expected. An earlier draft, dated the previous September, that routed the drainage toward a retention pond on association property. The correct, boring, legally unremarkable solution. A second draft, dated late October, rerouted it toward the western boundary instead, toward me. Someone had changed the plan 2 weeks before the board vote that approved it. The insurance certificate, when it finally surfaced, named Tom's Construction LLC as the policyholder, with a coverage limit that would not come close to covering the well contamination or property devaluation an engineer like Illich could credibly project if things worsened. I sat at my kitchen table with both drafts spread in front of me, September beside October, and felt the last piece settle into place. This hadn't been incompetence redirected by bad luck. Someone had looked at 2 options, one that cost the association money to fix properly, one that cost me everything instead, and chosen the second, then approved it through a board he controlled, using a company he owned, without telling the person whose land would absorb the consequence. I called Mara that night, no longer to ask a hypothetical question, but to ask her to formally represent me. She didn't hesitate. "Send me everything," she said. "The whole box." I photographed every page before I mailed it, a habit by then so ingrained I didn't consider not doing it, and drove the box to the post office myself the next morning, because some things you don't trust to a mailbox at the end of a driveway. Fields, the association's attorney, sent a letter 2 weeks later characterizing the matter as a misunderstanding regarding drainage easements, and offering to have the trenches filled and reseeded at the association's expense. No admission of fault in exchange for a signed release. I read it twice. The same careful, plain reading I gave everything now. Then I set it in the correspondence folder, unanswered, and let Mara draft the response instead. Some letters don't deserve my voice. They deserve procedure. Mara's response to Fields was 3 pages, and I read it the way I'd come to read everything by then, slowly, for what it didn't say as much as what it did. It didn't accuse anyone of malice. It didn't mention Gary by name more than the facts required. It laid out, in flat procedural language, the September and October drainage drafts, the timeline of the board vote, the registered ownership of Tom's Construction, the well test trend, and Illich's engineering assessment, and it declined the release. It requested instead a formal claim against the association's liability policy, a professional survey to establish the boundary damage, and remediation performed by a contractor with no relationship to any board member. Fields' reply came back faster than I expected, and shorter, a request for a meeting between counsel, no admission of anything, standard language. Mara told me on the phone that the speed itself meant something. Nobody moves that fast unless somebody upstairs is nervous. I found out who upstairs was 3 weeks later at the August board meeting, which by then I no longer attended quietly. Priya Anand had spent the summer asking the questions nobody else on the board wanted asked, and she'd apparently kept her own notes, separate from the official minutes. Notes she brought, unprompted, to a private conversation with me in the clubhouse parking lot after the July meeting. She told me the October drainage revision had come from Gary directly, over email to the engineering firm, 3 days after Tom's Construction had submitted its bid on the original September plan and been told, informally, that the retention pond route wouldn't need a contractor of Tom's size. The October revision, in other words, hadn't been an engineering decision at all. It had been a business decision, dressed up as one. Priya said she'd raised concerns at the November vote and been told the survey was still pending, that details would follow, that she was overthinking the drainage side of things. She'd voted yes anyway, trusting the board president the way you trust someone you've sat beside at a folding table for 6 years. She told me this not defensively, but plainly, the way people talk when they've realized they were used and are still deciding how angry to be about it. I didn't need her to be angry. I needed her to write it down. She did, a signed statement, dated, detailing the timeline as she remembered it, the emails she still had access to as a board member, the informal comment about Tom's bid. It went into the box, its own new section, board statements, Anand. The file didn't feel like a weapon to me, even then. It felt like a level, the kind you use to check whether something you built is actually straight or only looks that way from where you're standing. Gary's story had never been level. It had just taken until August for enough people to bring their own instruments and check. Something changed in me around that time, though it took a while to notice it happening. I stopped reacting to what the association did and started simply waiting to see what they'd do next. The way you wait out a storm you've already prepared for, not with dread, just with the mild, watchful patience of someone who's already checked the roof and stacked the sandbags. Fields requested the council meeting Mara had offered, and I let Mara handle the logistics while I did what I'd always done best. I kept working my land, kept my ledgers, kept photographing the trenches after every rain to track whether the erosion pattern was worsening, which it was, steadily, each storm carving the channels a little deeper toward the well corner. I didn't call Gary. I didn't run into him at the feed store and say anything pointed. When Renata called with a scheduling question about the boundary survey the association had finally agreed to fund, I answered plainly, gave her the dates I was available, and hung up without editorializing. That restraint did more work than anything I could have said. People like Gary Toms build their confidence on the assumption that the other side will eventually get emotional, get sloppy, say something that can be reframed as unreasonable. I'd watched him do it in that gravel lot. The practiced concern, the gentle redirection, all of it built to work on someone who'd respond to warmth with relief instead of documentation. It hadn't worked on me, and by autumn, I think he still didn't fully understand why. The survey came back in September, performed by an independent firm neither side controlled, and it confirmed what Illich's report had already said in less official language. The trenches diverted a documented volume of stormwater runoff from association drainage onto my property, at a rate and pattern inconsistent with the September engineering draft, and consistent instead with the October revision. It assigned for the first time a number E, an estimated 11,000 gallons per significant rain event, redirected onto land it had no legal right to touch. I filed the survey beside the two engineering drafts, September and October side by side, the number now sitting in black and white beneath them like a debt finally itemized. Dale Ferris, whose backyard flooding I'd first connected to my own trenches back in May, filed his own complaint that same month, citing my documentation as a reference. So did the woman with the leaning retaining wall, whose name I finally learned was Connie O'Sullivan. Neither of them had built a file the way I had. They didn't need to. Mine was thorough enough to carry weight for people who'd simply been annoyed and assumed, the way most people do, that annoyance was all they were entitled to feel. I didn't ask them to come forward. I hadn't organized anything. I'd simply been visible and consistent and unhurried long enough that other people started to trust their own instincts again, once they saw someone else's instincts had been right all along. By October, the association's attorney requested a settlement conference, and Mara told me plainly what that meant. They'd run the numbers on litigation risk and didn't like what they'd found. I still didn't feel triumph. I felt the particular quiet of a person watching weather finally break after a long, dry spell. Relief without celebration, because you know the ground still has to be walked and checked before you trust it again. The conference was held in a conference room at Fields' office, neutral ground, 6 people at a long table. Myself, Mara, Fields, Gary, a second board member named Wallace, who mostly stayed silent, and a claims adjuster from the association's insurer, a woman who took notes without once looking up. Gary tried the gravel lot voice one more time, early on, calling the whole matter an unfortunate misunderstanding that got bigger than it needed to. And I watched Fields' jaw tighten slightly, the way a lawyer's does when his client says something in front of opposing counsel that he'd specifically told him not to say. Mara didn't raise her voice. She laid out the file the way you'd lay out a hand you already know has won. The September and October drafts, the 11,000-gallon figure from the independent survey, Priya's signed statement about the bid timeline, Illich's assessment, the well test trend, the certified letters with their unmet deadlines. She didn't accuse Gary of anything beyond what the documents themselves said. She didn't have to. The documents did the accusing on their own, in that flat, undeniable language that a folder full of dates and signatures speaks better than any raised voice ever could. The adjuster asked at one point whether the association had any documentation contradicting the October revision's origin. Fields looked at Gary. Gary looked at the table. Nobody answered. That silence was the loudest thing in the room. We didn't settle that day. Settlement conferences rarely resolve in one sitting, Mara told me on the drive home. But something in the room had shifted permanently, the way air shifts before a front moves through, and everyone at that table had felt it, including Gary, whose easy confidence had, for the first time since March, gone somewhere quiet and hadn't come back out for the rest of the meeting. I drove home past the subdivision gate, past the clubhouse with its bulletin board of lawn height notices, and turned onto my own gravel road, the western pasture visible in the last of the daylight. 6 dark lines still cut into it, still waiting to be filled and made right. I hadn't gloated in that room. I hadn't needed to. I'd simply sat and listened and let a folder do what a folder does when it's been built correctly, carry more weight than anyone in the room could argue their way out from under. Word moves fast in a subdivision of 40 homes, faster than any board meeting minutes ever could, and by November, what had started as my private accordion file had become, without my doing much of anything, common knowledge across Meadowbrook Court and Whispering Pine Lane. I didn't spread it, I didn't need to. Dale Ferris and Connie O'Sullivan had both filed their own complaints citing the same documents, and complaints, once filed with the county, become part of a record other residents can request. People began requesting them. I started getting looks at the feed store that weren't unfriendly, exactly, just different. The look people give someone they've realized was right about something before anyone else was willing to believe it. A man I barely knew, from a house 2 streets past Dale's, stopped me outside the hardware store to say his own yard had been draining strangely since spring, and did I think that was connected? I told him what I always told people who asked by then. I don't know what caused your drainage, but here's who to call at the county if you want to find out for yourself. I gave out the oversight office's number more times that month than I gave out my own. The board meeting in November was the fullest I'd seen it. Residents who'd never once attended sat in folding chairs along the back wall, arms crossed, wading through the routine agenda items, landscaping bids, pool maintenance schedule. For the item everyone had actually come to hear, an update on the boundary drainage matter. Gary tried, one more time, to keep it brief, to characterize it as ongoing and under legal review. Nothing new to report. Priya Anand asked from the table whether the board intended to disclose to residents that the October drainage revision had originated from the board president's own construction company, and that the September plan, the one routing water to the retention pond, the one that wouldn't have flooded anyone, had been quietly discarded 2 weeks before the vote. The room went still in the particular way a room goes still when people realize they're about to hear something they'll repeat to their neighbors tomorrow. Gary said the matter was under legal review, and he wasn't in a position to discuss specifics. Priya said she wasn't asking him to discuss specifics. She was asking him to confirm a date on an email he'd sent. He didn't confirm it. He also didn't deny it. He adjourned the meeting 11 minutes early, citing a personal matter, and left through the side door instead of the front, past the pool nobody used after September, out into a parking lot full of cars belonging to people who, for the first time in 6 years, weren't looking at him the way they used to. I stayed behind and helped stack the folding chairs, the way I always did, and said nothing about any of it to anyone. The record had spoken for itself in that room. I didn't need to add a word. Wallace, the board member who'd sat silent through the settlement conference, called me the week after that November meeting, not through Renata, not through counsel, just his own number, dialed directly, which told me something had shifted even before he said a word. He wanted to know plainly whether I'd be willing to meet with him and Priya, without Gary, to discuss what he called next steps for the board. I told him I'd meet, but that Mara would need to be present, and that anything discussed would need to be understood as informal, nothing that could later be characterized as a private deal outside the claims process. He agreed to that without hesitation, which told me he'd already talked to a lawyer of his own, quietly, the kind of consultation people seek when they've started separating their own exposure from someone else's decisions. We met at a diner off the highway, neutral ground again, though this time nobody's attorney had picked the location. Wallace looked tired in the way people look when they've spent weeks reconciling what they thought they knew about a colleague with what the record now showed. He told me he'd voted for the October drainage plan without reading past the summary Gary had circulated, trusting a man he'd sat on the board with for 4 years. He told me he'd since pulled Tom's Construction's full bid history and found 2 other association contracts, smaller ones, awarded the same way, quietly steered. The September option never fully presented to the full board, the more expensive contractor conveniently unavailable or overbooked when the vote came around. This wasn't just about my trenches anymore. It never fully had been. It was a method, applied more than once, that had simply never been checked before because nobody had built a file thorough enough to check it against. I didn't feel vindicated hearing that. I felt something heavier and quieter, the particular weight of understanding that the thing you fought for yourself had also been protecting people who never knew they needed protecting. Dale's flooded backyard, Connie's leaning wall, two other contracts I hadn't even known to look for. Priya said the board intended to bring a motion for Gary's removal at the December meeting, under the bylaw's provision for breach of fiduciary duty, and asked whether I'd be willing to have Illick's report and the county survey entered as supporting documentation. I said yes. Not because I wanted to watch him fall, I want to be honest about that because it would be easy to pretend otherwise, but because the file had never been about Gary personally. It had been about what happens when someone assumes the person on the other side of a fence line won't keep records. I drove home past the western pasture in the dark, the shape of the trenches invisible now, but still there, still waiting, and understood that whatever happened in December, the ground itself would take longer to heal than the paperwork ever would. The December meeting was moved to the elementary school gymnasium because the clubhouse couldn't hold the number of people who'd said they were coming. I sat near the back with Mara, the accordion file, thinner now, most of its contents already copied into a formal binder Mara had prepared for the record, resting on my knees like something I'd carried too far to set down. The motion for Gary's removal was the second item on the agenda, after a perfunctory reading of November's minutes that nobody in the room seemed to be listening to. Priya read the motion aloud, citing the specific bylaw provision breach of fiduciary duty, self-dealing in the award of association contracts, and named the supporting documentation the September and October engineering drafts, the independent survey's 11,000-gallon figure, Illich's assessment, Wallace's review of the prior Tom's construction contracts, and my own certified correspondence showing the board's failure to meet its 30-day disclosure obligation under the bylaws Gary himself had signed off on years earlier. Gary was allowed to respond, as the bylaws required. He stood at the small podium the school had wheeled out for the occasion and gave a version of the gravel lot voice one more time, a longer version, more strained, talking about how much he'd given to this community, 6 years of unpaid service, evenings and weekends spent on landscaping bids and pool schedules and budget spreadsheets nobody else wanted to touch. He wasn't wrong about any of that. I want to be fair to him even now. He had given real time to that board, real effort, the kind that doesn't show up in a folder because nobody documents the ordinary competence of a person doing their job correctly. But then he got to the drainage matter, and the voice that had worked so well in a gravel lot with one skeptical farmer in April did not work in a gymnasium with 40 residents in December who had already read the documents themselves. He called it a business decision made under time pressure. He called the October revision a reasonable adjustment given contractor availability. He never once, in 9 minutes at that podium, said the word sorry, and I don't think anyone in that room missed the absence of it. Wallace spoke next, briefly, and said only that he'd reviewed the prior contracts himself, and could no longer, in good conscience, characterize any of it as a single lapse in judgment. Dale Ferris stood up during public comment and described his flooded backyard, simply, without theatrics, the way you describe a fact you've lived with for 8 months. Connie O'Sullivan described her leaning retaining wall the same way. Nobody asked me to speak. I hadn't planned to. But Priya, reading from her notes, asked whether I wanted to add anything on the record before the vote. I stood, and I kept it short, because I had learned by then that short and factual traveled further than anything else. I said I'd farmed that land for 11 years without a single drainage problem until the western trenches appeared, that I had a well 200 feet from those trenches and a young grandson who visited most weekends and drank water from that well, and that the file now sitting in a binder on the table in front of the board contained every document anyone would need to understand what had happened and why it mattered. I sat back down. Mara squeezed my hand once, briefly, under the table. The board called the vote. The vote to remove Gary Toms as board president, and separately as a board member entirely, passed 4-1. Wallace and Priya, and 2 others in favor. Gary himself, the lone dissent, since the bylaws didn't require him to abstain even in his own removal. He didn't argue after the vote was read. He gathered a folder of his own. Thinner than mine, I noticed. Thinner than it should have been for 6 years of board service. And walked out through the gymnasium's side door the same way he'd left the clubhouse in November, except this time, nobody looked away out of politeness. People watched him go. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected feeling months earlier, standing in that trench with mud past my boots. What I felt instead was closer to fatigue, the good kind, the kind that comes after a long job finally reaches its last necessary step. There was still the matter of the claim itself, separate from the board vote. The actual remediation of the trenches, the compensation for the well testing and the engineer's fee, and the diminished value of land that now had a documented contamination risk attached to its history, whether or not anything worse ever happened. That was settled in January, in a much smaller room than the gymnasium, just Mara and Fields and the insurer's adjuster and myself. No residents, no audience, the kind of quiet procedural conclusion that never makes it into anyone's retelling of a story because it isn't dramatic. The association's insurer agreed to fund a full remediation of the western pasture. Proper regrading, performed by a contractor with no ties to any board member, overseen by Illich to confirm it matched the original 1987 drainage plan my father had built. They agreed to compensate the well testing costs, the engineering fees, and a sum for the land's diminished value that Mara had calculated with a precision that left little room for negotiation, because precision, by then, was the only language I'd found the two sides consistently understood. I signed the settlement on a Tuesday in late January, sitting at Mara's office, the accordion file finally empty of purpose, its contents absorbed into a settlement agreement that ran to 11 pages and said, in its final clause, that the association acknowledged the drainage diversion had been performed without proper authorization or disclosure and agreed to restore the property to its prior condition at its own expense. It wasn't an apology, legal documents rarely are, but it was, in its own flat and undecorated way, the truth finally written down by people who had spent 10 months trying not to write it down at all. I drove home that evening, past the subdivision gate one more time, past the clubhouse, past the bulletin board that had, I noticed, a new notice about the upcoming board election, Priya's name listed as a candidate for president. I turned onto my own gravel road as the sun went down over the western pasture, and for the first time since March, I let myself imagine what that ground would look like once the trenches were finally filled and the grass grew back over them the way grass does, eventually over almost anything. The remediation crew came in March, almost exactly a year after the survey stakes first appeared, and I watched from the porch as they filled the trenches the way the original drainage plan had specified from the start. The September plan, the one that had cost more, the one nobody had wanted to pay for until a folder full of dated photographs and certified letters made paying for it the only remaining option. Illich came out himself to oversee the final grading, walking the pasture with a level and a notebook of his own, checking his measurements against the assessment he'd written the previous summer. He told me, standing at the low corner near the well, that it would take a full growing season before the ground settled fully back into its natural contour, maybe 2 before the grass covered the scarring completely. I told him I had time. 11 years of farming that land had taught me that most things worth restoring take longer than you'd like and happen anyway, provided you keep tending them. I had the well tested one more time in April, the third baseline in a series that now told its own quiet story. The nitrate levels, which had ticked upward through the summer of the trenches, beginning to fall back toward where they'd started before any of this happened. Not proof of nothing exactly, proof of correction. Proof that a thing set wrong could, with enough attention and enough insistence on the record, be set right again, even if it never fully forgot having been wrong. Gary Tom sold his house in the subdivision that spring and moved, I heard, to a town 2 counties over. I didn't feel triumph hearing that either. I felt what I imagine most people feel at the end of something long and quiet and correctly handled. Not joy, exactly, but the settling of a debt that had been owed and was now, finally, paid. Tom's Construction's business license, I learned later from the same county registry I'd once printed off in a kitchen at 11 at night, lapsed that summer and was never renewed. Priya won the board presidency in the spring election, unopposed. Wallace stayed on. Dale Ferris and Connie O'Sullivan both received their own settlements that summer, smaller than mine, but real, backed by documentation that existed only because I'd been thorough enough months earlier that other people learned to trust their own eyes again. I still keep the accordion file. It's empty now. Mostly, the contents long since transferred to Mara's records and my own fireproof box, but I haven't thrown it away. It sits on a shelf in the mudroom beside my father's old ledgers, a plain cardboard thing with pencil labels that have started to fade. I look at it sometimes when I walk past, not with anger, not anymore, but with the particular respect you hold for a tool that did exactly what it was built to do. The grass came back that second summer, thick and even, no trace of the trenches left in the ground at all. Only I would ever know, walking that pasture now, exactly where they'd been. People ask me sometimes at the feed store or the co-op meeting whether I feel like I won something. I never know quite how to answer that, because winning implies a scoreboard, a moment where the number changes and everyone claps, and nothing about that year felt like that. It felt like tending, Like walking a fence line every morning for months, checking the same 6 posts, noticing the same small give in the wire, and fixing it a little at a time until one day you realize the fence is held through a storm that would have taken it down a year earlier. What changed, concretely, was simple enough to list. The trenches were filled, and the pasture regraded to the original 1987 contour. The well tested clean, its nitrate trend restored to baseline. The settlement covered what it needed to cover precisely, without excess and without shortfall, the way good documentation tends to produce good outcomes when it's finally read by people with the authority to act on it. The board changed hands, not through anger, but through a bylaw provision written for exactly this purpose, used correctly for maybe the first time in its history. 2 other homeowners were made whole because a pattern I'd documented for my own land turned out to explain damage on theirs. What didn't change was harder to name and took longer to notice. I still walk that western pasture most mornings, out of habit built over 3 decades, and there are still days I find myself glancing at the low corner near the well, checking, the way you check a wound long after the doctors told you it's healed, just to be sure. The grass grew back thick, but I know where the trenches were the way you know where a scar sits on your own skin, even after the redness fades. Not painful anymore, just permanently present in your accounting of the place. I think about the cost of patience more than I used to. 10 months is a long time to hold something steady without letting it curdle into bitterness, and I won't pretend every day of it felt like the calm, measured version I've been describing. There were nights I sat at that kitchen table with the accordion file open and felt something much closer to rage than resolve, and had to remind myself, out loud sometimes, alone in the house, that rage documented poorly and rage documented precisely produce very different outcomes in a room full of people deciding whether to believe you. The restraint wasn't natural. It was chosen, over and over, on nights when the easier thing would have been to drive to that gravel lot and say everything I was thinking instead of writing it down and going to bed. I don't know that I'd call that wisdom. I think I'd call it inheritance. My father built that drainage system by hand in 1987 without ever once raising his voice about anything I can remember, and I think what he actually taught me, across all those quiet years of watching him work, wasn't how to dig a trench correctly. It was how to be the kind of person whose word and whose paper could be trusted completely, so that when the day came you needed them to carry weight, they simply would, without your having to insist on it. That's what Gary Toms never understood about the woman he met in that gravel lot in April. He saw a farmer standing alone in mud, easy to manage with a practiced smile and a vague promise to look into things. He never once considered that the notebook in my hand that day would still be full and still true 10 months later in a room he couldn't smile his way out of. My grandson visited this past weekend, the way he does most Saturdays, and we walked the western pasture together the way I used to walk it with my father, him pointing at things and asking what they were, me answering the way my father once answered me. He asked why part of the grass looked slightly different from the rest, a faint variation in shade that only someone who'd watched that ground for 2 years would ever notice. I told him the truth, in the plain way I try to tell him most things, that a neighbor had once dug something there that shouldn't have been dug, and that it took a long time and a lot of paperwork to make it right again, and that it was right again now. He asked if I was mad at the neighbor. I told him I wasn't, not anymore, and found, saying it out loud to a 7-year-old on a Saturday morning, that it was true. Anger doesn't hold its shape the way documentation does. It fades on its own schedule, whether or not you get the outcome you wanted, and I'd gotten the outcome I wanted, which made the fading easier than it might have been otherwise. What I keep, instead of anger, is the habit the whole year left behind. I still date every photograph I take on that land. I still keep a notebook on the kitchen counter, though these days it's more likely to record calving dates and hay yields than trench measurements and certified mail receipts. I still read every notice that comes from the county, every letter from anyone claiming authority over anything touching my property line, twice, slowly, the way you read something you intend to remember exactly. I think that's the real cost of what happened, and also, strangely, the gift of it. I learned, at 51 years old, on land I'd already worked for 3 decades, that the most powerful thing a quiet person can do is refuse to let silence be mistaken for surrender. Gary Toms mistook my stillness for weakness in that gravel lot in April, the same way I imagine he'd mistaken a lot of people's stillness for weakness over 6 years of quietly steering contracts toward his own company. He was wrong about me, specifically, but I don't think he was wrong to expect it to work. It usually does. That's what made the file, once it was finally built and finally read aloud in a gymnasium full of neighbors, feel less like a personal victory and more like a small correction to a pattern that had been running, unchecked, for longer than anyone had bothered to notice. The trenches are gone now. The grass has closed back over them completely, and in another year or two, I expect even I won't be able to find the line where the old scar sat. But the notebook stays on the counter, and the folder stays on the shelf in the mudroom, and I keep both the way my father kept his ledgers, not out of fear that something like this will happen again, but out of the simple, permanent understanding that if it ever does, I already know exactly what to do.